Right off the bat, note this is not the typical Self-Evident series episode. Rather, it is a teaching episode, hence the whiteboard, and this will act as a companion episode for the middle part of the series. As such, it carries no liberty or philosophical argument of its own. It is purely the history. Now, on the other hand, weeks 8 through 15 and their corresponding Part A, Part B, and interview episodes, they follow arguments. They're going to follow a lawyer insisting the common law bounds the king, a regiment debating the franchise in a church at Putney, a philosopher justifying revolution, a generation of Scots and Frenchmen asking what a free society requires, and each of those follows a mind. None of them keeps a running account of who held the throne while that mind was at work, or what that person was doing to the people who lived under him, or her. This hour supplies that account. It runs from the ascension of Henry VIII in 1509 to the Declaration of Independence in 1776 with a short coda to 1783. It is built to be heard once straight through and then returned to in pieces. Use the chapter links below in the YouTube comments to be able to jump back and forth to where you want to review. The question it answers is this. When Sir Edward Coke told his king that the common law would control the acts of the crown, who was that king? What had he already claimed? And what had he already done? The arguments of the next 8 weeks were made against particular men in particular years. This is who those men were. And of course, I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions Podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
4 things by the end of this episode. First, which monarch sits behind which article? James I and Charles I are the monarchs behind Coke in Article 8. Charles I and the early interregnum stand behind the levelers in Article 9. Charles II and James II stand behind Sidney and Locke in Article 10. And James II and then William and Mary stand behind the Glorious Revolution in Article 11. And finally, the 4 Hanoverians stand behind the Scottish and Continental thinkers of Articles 12 through 15. That's the first thing that we will cover in this episode. The second component piece is how the powers of the crown were assembled and then taken apart, one statute and one reported case at a time. And third, why a parliament that had bound a king went on to claim a power over the colonies that no king ever held. And lastly, the 4 points in this account where the historians disagree. 13 reigns and one stretch without a monarch cover the period. From Henry VIII to George III, the Kingless years sitting between Charles I and Charles II. 2 features of this list deserve notice. The first is, how many of these reigns ended irregularly? Between 1603 and 1714, just over 100 years, one monarch was executed, one fled and was deemed to have abdicated, one was invited by conspirators, and one was seated by an act of parliament over the claims of more than 50 persons with better hereditary title. The English crown of this period was not a stable institution that occasionally suffers a crisis. It was an institution whose terms were renegotiated roughly every generation. The second is the religion of each monarch. From 1534 onward, what a monarch believed was not private. It determined who could hold office, who could worship lawfully, who could inherit, and whether armed resistance was thought justified. And the religious test on an office outlasted this period by well over a century. Anyone who wonders why Article 5 through Article 11 and those corresponding episodes kept returning to conscience, you'll find those answers there. Henry VIII. Henry VIII, I am. Henry VIII, I am. Henry VIII ruled from 1509 to 1547. Now, this is a time period we've already covered in previous episodes, but it's interesting to understand how this plays in to the later monarchs in the English kingdom. First, the English Reformation was accomplished by statute, and that fact matters more for their series than any question of doctrine. And the occasion was a marriage. Henry wanted his union with Catherine of Aragon annulled so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, and Rome would not give the annulment. He went through 6 wives in the end, and the schoolroom rhyme still keeps the score. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And 2 of the 6 he had executed. What matters here is not the appetite, it is the method. Denied by the Pope, Henry did not just simply defy Rome, he had Parliament legislate Rome out of the picture entirely. Between 1529 and 1536, the assembly, later called the Reformation Parliament, severed the English Church from Rome. The Act in Restraint of Appeals in 1533 declared that the realm of England was an empire governed by one supreme head, and that appeals in spiritual causes could no longer run outside of the kingdom. The Act of Supremacy the following year made the king the supreme head on the Church of England. The dissolutions that followed transferred monastic property on a scale that reshaped the English gentry, many of whom acquired lands they would have no interest in returning. Now, Henry himself remained doctrinally conservative. He died holding to transubstantiation and clerical celibacy. And he burned Protestants as readily as he executed Catholics who denied the supremacy. To call him a Protestant is to misstate what actually happened. What happened was jurisdictional. Now, two consequences that run forward. A Parliament had demonstrated that statute could reach anything. The church, the succession, property held for centuries, and the definition of treason. And the crown had acquired authority over conscience that no English monarch had claimed before. Article 8 is largely the record of Coke attempting to bound the first claim, while Articles 5 through 7 are the record of Europeans working out what to do about the second. And keep the wives in view, because the next 3 reigns come directly out of them. Edward was the son of Jane Seymour. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. 3 children, 3 mothers, and between 1547 and 1559, the country changed its official religion 3 times. In the order the mothers would predict. Parliament had declared 2 of those children illegitimate and then restored them to the succession by statute. That is the claim of unbounded statutory reach in its plainest possible form, applied to a man's own children. Edward VI. Now, Edward VI reigned from 1547 to 1553. That's a short time period. Well, Edward himself came to the throne at 9 years old and died at 15. Now, what's important to this to understand is that his reign was not really his. He was a minor. His reign moved England toward genuine Protestant doctrine through the prayer books of 1549 and 1552. Its significance, though, is structural rather than theological. England was governed for 6 years by councils acting on the behalf of the king in the name of a child. In the machinery, much like the Dutch had found out, the machinery ran without a true sovereign. Whatever divine right was later claimed for the persons of the monarch, the realm had already shown it could be administered without an adult one. The next one on the list, after Edward VI, was Mary I. And Mary ruled from 1553 to 1558. Mary restored the papal supremacy and prosecuted heresy with severity. Something near 300 people were burned and several hundred more fled the continent. Posterity gave her the name that stuck. She is Bloody Mary, though the work is largely the work of Protestant writers after her death rather than the subjects who lived under her. It still retains to this day. Those who fled produced material that matters most here. In Strasbourg in 1556, John Putney published a short treatise of politic power, arguing that political authority derives from the people, that rulers are subject to law, and that a tyrant may lawfully be deposed and even killed. In Geneva in 1558, Christopher Goodman published How Superior Powers Ought to be Obeyed, holding that the ordinary subject bears a duty to resist an idolatrous ruler when the magistrates who should have protected the realm have failed. This is English resistance theory written in English by Englishmen 2 generations before the Stuarts arrived. Article 6 treats the continental development of these arguments. What this hour adds is that England had its own branch, and that branch did not wither. Putney was reprinted in England in 1642 with an earlier edition recorded before 1640. This is precisely when the quarrel with Charles I made the question live a second time. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because after Mary I was Elizabeth I. And Elizabeth I ruled from 1558 to 1603. And that's quite a long time relatively to a couple of the other previous monarchs that were before her. Or I should say, supreme governors. The settlement of 1559 restored royal authority over the church with a change of title that was more than cosmetic. Elizabeth became supreme governor rather than supreme head, conceding something to those who held that no layperson and no woman could head a church. Remember, Mary was Catholic, so the supreme head of the church under her reign was not Mary, was not a woman, it was the Pope. So this change with Elizabeth bringing back Protestantism was very important so that she would be supreme governor rather than supreme head. 2 conflicts then of the reign anticipate the Stuart crisis directly. The first concerned free speech in the Commons. Peter Wentworth and his brother Paul pressed the claim that members must be able to debate any matter, including the succession of the church, without royal interference. Elizabeth disagreed, and Peter Wentworth spent time in the Tower for pressing it. The privilege was asserted, it was denied, and it was left unresolved. The second, much more interesting in my opinion, concerned monopolies. Elizabeth granted exclusive patents over ordinary commodities, salt, starch, even playing cards. She granted these patents to her courtiers, who collected the rents. Parliamentary anger in 1601 was sharp enough that the Queen retreated, promising redress in what became known as the Golden Speech. The litigation that followed, the case of the monopolies, held that the playing card patent was invalid. The conventional account in which Coke curbs the prerogative inverts the record. Coke appeared as Attorney General arguing for the patent. He was the Crown's advocate, and he lost. How that case entered constitutional memory is disputed, and I'll come back to it a little bit later. Now, Elizabeth died in 1603, having never named a successor in any formal act. What passed to James I, who was also known as James VI because he was the King of Scotland before Elizabeth's death. What passed to James was a crown claiming supremacy over conscience, a parliament with a memory of extraordinary statutory power, an unsettled quarrel over prerogative revenue, an unresolved claim to free debate, and a body of English resistance writing already in print. One more thing about Elizabeth, because of what it tells you about the man who followed her. Elizabeth had held her cousin and rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, in English custody for 19 years. And in 1587, she signed the warrant that took Mary's head. Mary's son was James. And when James came south and took the English throne, he built tombs for both women in the Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey. I've seen both of these tombs in person, and it's quite impressive. Elizabeth, he placed on the north aisle in a single monument shared with her Catholic half-sister, Mary I, whose name barely registers on it. His own mother, he placed in the south aisle, directly opposite, under a larger and much finer canopy. They're still there. The queen who signed the death warrant and the queen who died under it lie in the same chapel, facing each other across it. And on the floor beside Elizabeth, there's now an inscription asking that all of those who died at the Reformation for conscience on either side of it be remembered together. The man who inherited all of this had a published theory of divine right before he ever crossed the border. James I, 1603 to 1625. As I mentioned, he was James VI of Scotland, and he became James I of England, uniting the crowns in his person while the kingdoms remained separate. The True Law of Free Monarchies, printed in 1598, held that the kings were made by God and that they preceded parliaments and the law itself, and that subjects owed obedience even to a wicked king whose punishment belonged to God alone. The theory met English practice where it usually did, which was revenue. Extraordinary taxation required parliamentary consent, and the ordinary income of the crown did not cover its ordinary expenses. To anyone living in 2026 America, we know what deficits are and we know how they run. Now, Bates's case in 1606 tested one way around that arithmetic. A merchant refused to pay an imposition on currents that Parliament had not granted, and in the Court of Exchequer found for the crown, reasoning that the absolute prerogative of the king over foreign trade permitted duties imposed for reasons of state. The judgment opened a revenue stream that required no commons. Again, if we're bringing this to contemporary times, it sounds a lot like tariffs issued by executive order. But we'll come back to that much later on in the series. Now, Coke collided with James from a different direction. As Chief Justice, he maintained that the king could not decide cases in person, that the common law bounded the prerogative, and in the passage from Dr. Bonham's case that Article 8 and Episode 8, Part A examine, that the common law would control acts of parliament and adjudge them void when they ran against common right and reason. James dismissed him in 1616, but Coke returned as a parliamentarian, which is where the confrontation matured. After James was Charles I. Charles I ruled from 1625 to 1649, and he inherited his father's theory without any of his father's flexibility. Denied adequate supply, he raised a forced loan in 1626 and imprisoned those who refused it without stating a cause. 5 knights sued for habeas corpus in 1627 and lost, the court accepting that a commitment by special command of the king required no further justification. The Commons answered the Petition of Right in 1628, drafted with Coke's hand on it. No taxation without parliamentary consent, no imprisonment without cause shown, and no billeting of soldiers on civilians, and finally, no martial law over civilians in peacetime. The 4 statements from Coke. Charles assented and then governed as though he had not. From 1629 to 1640, he called no parliament at all, funding the personal rule by reviving obsolete prerogative revenues. Ship money, traditionally raised from coastal towns for naval defense in emergency, was extended inland and collected annually in peacetime. John Hampden refused to pay and lost in 1637, though narrowly, and the narrowness was instructive. A substantial minority of the judges held against the crown. Again, think about this. The crown is saying that it is above parliament. It suspends parliament or doesn't call parliament, but it needs revenues to run. So it uses its prerogative to pull revenues from the ship towns. This is very similar to what we see going throughout history, where the executive claims authority to tax on the people. In this case, somebody sued John Hampden. He refused to pay, but he lost. But in that loss, a substantial minority of the judges held still against the crown. And this was still something. It's what's called a moral victory, I guess, but it did start setting the tone for what happened after. Now, religion supplied the accelerant. Archbishop Laud pressed ceremonial uniformity, punishing critics by mutilation as well as imprisonment. When the prayer book the Scots called Lauds was imposed on Scotland in 1637, the Scots raised an army, and they defeated the king's forces at Newburn in 1640. Charles needed money on a scale only Parliament could supply. The Long Parliament abolished a Star Chamber and High Commission. It executed Stratford by attainder and declared ship money illegal. And it passed an act preventing its own dissolution without consent. That's got some significant wavos there, right? Parliament says, yeah, you didn't call us, but now you cannot dismiss us. You cannot dissolve us without our own consent. And in January 1642, Charles entered the Commons with armed men to arrest 5 members. They had gone. And within months, the country was at war. One of the things about history, the same themes come back and back again. And this whole episode here we have the English Civil War. It has a very Roman feel to it, doesn't it? Caesar and the Senate. We talked about Cicero at the beginning of this entire series. This harkens right back to this some 1,600 years later, 1,700 years later. Now, Parliament won the Civil War. And that's a whole episode in itself. But again, this is a brief history to bring you up to the point. At this point, Charles I lost. Parliament won through the New Model Army. In January 1649, Charles was tried by a court whose jurisdiction he refused to acknowledge. He was convicted of treason against the kingdom, and Charles I was beheaded. The morning was bitterly cold, and he asked for an extra shirt. He did not want to shiver on the scaffold and have the crowd take it for fear. He was executed at 2 p.m. on a platform put up in front of the banqueting house at Whitehall, a building his father had commissioned. The claim embedded in that proceeding is the one Articles 9 and 10 pursue. A king had been tried by his subjects for offenses against a people from whom his authority was said to derive. Whatever the legal irregularities, and they were considerable, the theory required to justify it was the theory of Ponnet and Goodman, now enforced by an army. The Kingless years, 1649 to 1660. No kings, the first time, 1649 to 1660. And this period matters here because it is the one stretch when the alternative was tried. The Rump Parliament abolished the monarchy and the House of Lords and declared a Commonwealth. Executive authority sat in the Council of State. Real power sat with the army. The Levelers pressed hardest during these years, and Article 9 and Episode 9 treats their program in full. A written constitution in the successive versions of the Agreement of the People, an extended franchise, religious liberty, equality before the law, and limits placed beyond the reach of any parliament. The Putney debates of 1647 recorded the argument inside the army itself over how far the franchise should reach. The movement was broken by force, and Leveler mutineers were shot at Beaufort in May 1649, less than 4 months after the king's execution, by the same army that had made the execution possible. The most radical constitutionalists of the English Revolution were suppressed by the Revolution's own military authority within a single year of its greatest victory. Government by written constitution arrived anyway, in a form the Levelers would not have chosen. The instrument of government of 1653 was England's first written national constitution, and one of only 2 the country has ever had. It installed Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector for life. Cromwell dissolved parliaments that displeased him. And in 1655, he divided England into districts under major generals exercising military and moral supervision, an experiment detested enough that it was abandoned within 2 years. In 1657, Parliament offered him the crown, but he refused, accepting instead a revised settlement that restored an upper house and allowed him to name his successor. He named his son Richard Cromwell, and Richard lasted some 8 months. The army removed him, and the recalled Rump failed to govern. And General George Monk marched south from Scotland to arrange the elections that produced a convention parliament. And the convention parliament invited Charles II to return. For a series concerned with delegated authority, the interregnum resists easy use. The men who executed a king for making war on his own people proceeded to govern without the consent they had fought for. The army that fought for the liberties of the subject shot the subjects who took those liberties most seriously. And the office that replaced the monarchy acquired, in Cromwell's hands, a discretionary reach that the Stuarts had claimed but never achieved. Charles II. Charles II ruled from 1660 to 1685. The Restoration. The Restoration settled accounts with the dead as well as the living. On the 13th of January, 1661, the 12th anniversary of the day Charles I was beheaded, Cromwell's body was taken out of Westminster Abbey, hanged in chains at Tyburn, and beheaded. Again, the body was taken out of Westminster Abbey, hanged in chains, and beheaded. The head was set on a pole above Westminster Hall, the building where Charles I had been tried, and it stayed there for more than 20 years. Cromwell had been dead for over 2 years when the sentence was carried out. Talk about a little morbid, maybe a little gross. And Charles returned on terms set out in the Declaration of Breda, a general pardon, arrears of army pay, and liberty to tender consciences, each subject to parliamentary confirmation. The last promise did not survive contact with the Cavalier Parliament. Between 1661 and 1665, that Parliament passed Clarendon Code, which required the Book of Common Prayer, drove some 2,000 ministers from their livings, and restricted nonconformist assembly. And it barred dissenting ministers from corporate towns. The Test Act of 1673 required office holders to take Anglican communion and to declare against transubstantiation. That of 1678 reached both houses, with a proviso exempting the king's brother. Restoration Anglicanism was, in law, considerably less tolerant of Protestant dissent than the regime it replaced, which had been considerably less tolerant of Anglicans. Charles pursued relief by prerogative instead, suspending the penal laws by a declaration of indulgence in 1672. Parliament forced its withdrawal by making supply conditional. And 2 years earlier, he had concluded the secret Treaty of Dover with Louis XIV, taking French subsidies against a private undertaking to declare himself Catholic when circumstances allowed. Suspicion of exactly that erupted in 1678 when Titus Oates fabricated a popish plot. The perjury cost at least 22 innocent men their lives before it collapsed, and more if you include the priests that were executed in persecution thereafter. Out of the attempt to exclude the king's Catholic brother from succession came the two parties that organized the next century of English politics. Whigs, who supported exclusion, and Tories, who opposed it as an attack on hereditary right. Oates himself was tried for perjury in 1685, and once James was on the throne, he was defrocked, put in the pillory, and whipped through the streets of London, and then sentenced to imprisonment for life. He served 3 years. When William came over in 1688, Oates was released and he was granted a pension. The man whose perjury had sent innocent men to the scaffold ended his career drawing money from the public purse. So Charles won that fight. He dissolved 3 parliaments over exclusion, and after 1681, called none. Sustained by French money, he then used writs of quo warranto to force the surrender of borough charters and reissue them on terms giving the crown control of municipal corporations and therefore of the men who returned members to parliament and impaneled juries. The Rye House plot of 1683 supplied the occasion for the reckoning Article 10 examines. Algernon Sidney was convicted of treason on one witness supplanted by the manuscript of his unpublished discourses concerning government, on the theory that writing itself was an overt act. He was executed that December, and Locke, whose associations were similar, left for the Dutch Republic. The lessons colonists later drew from this reign was not primarily about Catholicism. It was that a king with an independent revenue does not need a parliament, and that charters could be revoked by legal process, as Massachusetts learned when its own was vacated in 1684. James II. Short, 1685 to 1688. James succeeded peacefully and lost the throne in under 4 years. He defeated Monmouth's rebellion and permitted the bloody Assizes that followed, in which several hundred were executed and many more were transported. He kept a standing army in peacetime in London, and when Parliament objected, he prorogued it and never met it again. His central instrument was the dispensing of power, the claim that the king could exempt named individuals from statutes. Godin against Hales in 1686 tested a case arranged for the purpose. Sir Edward Hales, a Catholic convert holding military command without the required oaths, was sued by his own servant for the informer's reward, and the king's bench found for Hales. James had removed 6 of the 12 judges before the trial. The court was packed. Whether the legal question was frivolous is disputed, and I will return to it. But armed with the ruling, James suspended the penal laws entirely by provocation in 1687 and admitted Catholics to office, the universities, and the army. A second declaration of indulgence in April 1688, he ordered read from every pulpit. 7 bishops petitioned against the order and were prosecuted for seditious libel. Their acquittal that June was greeted with public celebration. The same month, his wife bore a son, displacing his Protestant daughters and converting a temporary difficulty into a Catholic dynasty. That birth produced one of the most consequential rumors in English history. Protestant opponents put it that the Queen's child had been stillborn, and that another woman's baby had been smuggled into the bedchamber, concealed in a warming pan. The story grew out of testimony that a warming pan had in fact been carried into the room for warmth. James answered it by convening the Privy Council and taking sworn statements from dozens of witnesses to the birth, which settled nothing. William of Orange named the doubts about the child as one of his stated reasons for coming over. Within days of the acquittal, 7 men invited William of Orange to intervene. William landed in November with a substantial fleet and an army. Support for James dissolved, and he fled to France. William III and Mary II, 1689 to 1702. William and Mary. The Convention Parliament solved its central problem by evasion. Tories could not accept that the subjects might depose a king, and Whigs would not accept that James remained one. The formula adopted held that James had broken the original contract, violated the fundamental laws, and withdrawn himself, thereby abdicating and leaving the throne vacant. The Declaration of Right, later enacted as the Bill of Rights, condemned specific abuses and secured specific remedies. No suspending of laws without parliamentary consent, no dispensing power as recently assumed, no standing army in peacetime without consent, no taxation by prerogative, free elections, freedom of debate in Parliament, no excessive bail or fines, no cruel or unusual punishments, and the right of Protestant subjects to have arms for their defense suitable to their conditions and allowed by law. We touch on all of these in Article and Episode 11, and we go in great detail. The Toleration Act of that same year permitted Protestant dissenters to worship, subject to registration and oaths. It did not extend to Catholics or to those denying the Trinity, and it left the Test Acts intact. Toleration meant relief from prosecution, not equality of civil status. Two changes did more to bind the crown than any Declaration of Rights, and the first was fiscal. William's wars required borrowing on a scale that produced the Bank of England in 1694 and funded national debt serviced by taxes Parliament voted. A crown financed by debt that Parliament must service cannot govern without Parliament. The second was procedural. The Mutiny Act had made military discipline depend on renewed parliamentary authority. And the Triennial Act of 1694 required parliaments to meet at least every 3 years and to be dissolved within 3. The Act of Settlement in 1701 secured the Protestant succession in the House of Hanover and added restraints beyond it. Judges were to hold office during good behavior with salaries established, removable only by the address of both houses, which ended, from the Hanoverian succession onward, the Stuart practice of dismissing judges who ruled inconveniently. No royal pardon could be pleaded against impeachment by the Commons. After William and Mary, Anne came to the throne from 1702 to 1714. Now, her reign completed the settlement in 2 respects. The Acts of Union in 1707 merged the English and Scottish parliaments into a Parliament of Great Britain. This was achieved through commercial inducement and the exclusionary pressure of the Alien Act, and also the disbursements from a fund called the Equivalent, whose charter historians still dispute, and again, I will come back to that as well. And on the 11th of March in 1708, Anne withheld royal assent from the Scottish Militia Bill on the advice of ministers who feared that a Scottish militia might prove disloyal with a Franco-Jacobite invasion fleet at sea. No British monarch has refused assent to legislation since. The veto did not die everywhere. Denial of assent exercised through royal instructions to colonial governors continued in the colonies for another 70 years. And it appears in the Declaration of Independence as a charge that the king refused assent to the laws necessary for public good and forbade his governors to pass laws of pressing importance. The prerogative that had become a dead letter in Britain remained live in America. That asymmetry is one of the most direct constitutional grievances of 1776, and it is invisible unless the two histories are read together. Now, the Hanoverian regime started with George I, who arrived from Hanover in 1714 under a statutory title, with more than 50 persons of superior hereditary claim passed over for being Catholic. Now, George I, if you've watched the movie King Ralph, you kind of get a feel for what happened there. They went through hereditary lineage down by down by down through 50 people before they got to George I, and they brought him over from Hanover. Now, a Jacobite rising following in 1715 failed, and a more dangerous one in 1745 reached Derby before turning back, and it ended at Culloden. Though the 15 was the larger mobilization of the two, the 45 is the rising most people have seen picture of. And increasingly, that picture comes from the series Outlander. The prince who lands in the Hebrides, marched to Derby, and is broken at Culloden is Charles Edward Stuart, called Bonnie Prince Charles, and he was the grandson of James II. Now, it's worth being clear about what he was fighting for. This is not a romantic cause in the abstract. He was fighting the Act of Settlement. His grandfather had lost the throne in 1688. His father had been passed over by statute in 1701 for being Catholic, and the rising was an armed attempt to undo that statute. Culloden is where the Act of Settlement stopped being contestable by force. The constitutional development of these reigns was not a matter of formal law. It was the growth of a ministerial government. The Septennial Act of 1716 extended the maximum life of Parliament from 3 years to 7, and it was passed by a Whig majority anxious about its prospects and applied to the sitting Parliament, which thereby extended its own terms from 3 years to 7 years. Elections became rarer, and the value of a seat rose. Robert Walpole dominated government from 1721 to 1742, managing the commons through patronage. Places, pensions, sinecures, and contracts went to members and their relations, and the civil list supplied a fund for the purpose. Critics called it Robinocracy. Walpole did not deny so much the practice as treat it as the ordinary means of making governments work. Sounds like a lot of politicians we have today. And there is a defense available here, which the country writers never fully answered. A monarch who could not manage a commons and a commons that could not sustain a ministry had produced the instability of the previous century. So patronage brought a stability that formal constitutional machinery had not delivered. But alongside it grew the cabinet, and George I attended councils irregularly, and as the reign went on, much less often, and business settled on a group of ministers who met without him and were coordinated by one of them. No statute created the office of prime minister. It just emerged from the arrangement. There's a small monument to the fact in the early 1730s, George II offered Walpole a house on Downing Street. Downing Street sounds familiar, right? Well, Walpole declined it as a personal gift and asked instead that it be attached to the office of the First Lord of Treasury, so that whoever held the post would have the use of it. He moved in on the 22nd of September, 1735. The most famous address in British politics, 10 Downing, belongs to an office that no law ever created. The result, by 1760, was a crown genuinely constrained by the ways the Bill of Rights specified, and genuinely unaccountable in ways that the document had not anticipated. It could not tax without Parliament or keep an army without consent. It could, through the ministry, manage a legislature elected on a franchise covering a small fraction of adult men. Now, no article in this arc treats the following writers directly, which is why I will mention it now in this segment. They are the channel through which the 17th century English constitutional argument reached 18th century America. The division that mattered in Hanoverian politics ran between court and country rather than only between Whig and Tory. The court interest held the office and distributed patronage. The country interest, drawn from both parties, held that the placemen and the pensioners in the Commons corrupted the Constitution at its root. That standing armies were the instrument of tyranny. That public debt created a moneyed interest with a stake in war. I'm just going to stop there and ask you to think about the contemporary articles, to think about the Empire of Liberty series. If you haven't watched the Empire of Liberty series, if you haven't read those articles, go back and just take into context what I just said there. It's coming out pre-American Revolution. That standing armies were the instruments of tyranny. That public debt created a moneyed interest with a stake in war. Unfortunately, most of Europe would learn those messages the hard way in the 20th century. And that septennial parliaments, 7 years parliaments, had severed representatives from those they had represented it. Seems like a common theme. The writing that produced this was extensive. Robert Molesworth's account of Denmark in 1694 studied how a free people had lost its liberties within living memory. Between 1720 and 1723, John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon published Cato's letters in the London press, arguing for freedom of speech as the bulwark of all other rights, warning that power encroaches wherever it is not resisted, and treating corruption as the ordinary mechanism by which free constitutions die. Bolingbroke's Craftsman attacked Walpole from 1726. James Berg's Political Disquisitions cataloged the abuses at length and was read attentively in the colonies. These arguments lost in Britain. Walpole governed for 2 decades. The Septennial Act stood, the debt grew, and the placemen kept their seats. But those arguments did not lose in America. Colonial printers reprinted Cato's letters heavily. And the reason is not obscure. A colonist looking at a royal governor with an independent salary, a parliament in which he had no member, no representation, and a garrison he had not consented to house, found that the country diagnosis fitted the circumstances exactly. While the court answer, that patronage was the price of stable government, offered him nothing, since he received none of the patronage and none of the representation. The general warrant cases sharpened the point. When John Wilkes attacked the ministry in issue 45 of the North Brighton in 1763, the Secretary of State issued a warrant naming no one, under which some 4 dozen people were arrested. Wilkes sued and won. In Intech against Carrington in 1765, a case about the seizure of a named man's papers rather than about general warrants, Lord Camden held that the executive possessed no power to break into a subject's house and seize his papers absent authority in law, and that silence in the law books on such a power was itself decisive against it. Colonists followed these cases closely, and the principle appears in our own Fourth Amendment. Now, they did more than follow them. In 1769, 6 years after number 45, a party of Connecticut settlers laid out a town in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania and named it for 2 of the members of Parliament who had defended the colonies in debate, John Wilkes and Isaac Barr or Barry. It's hard to know what his name was pronounced at the time. There's no account, which is why today you know this town as either Wilkes-Barre, Wilkes-Barre, Wilkes-Barre. Hard to pronounce. Most people in Pennsylvania call it Wilkes-Barre. But even now, it's still disputed how Isaac pronounced his last name. He was of descent of French Huguenots, raised in Irish England, moved to Parliament. So it is a little bit ambiguous how his last name was pronounced, even for him. Kind of like Carnegie and Carnegie. But I digress. Americans in 1770 sounded like the Englishmen of 1720 because they were reading the Englishmen of 1720. Article 18 will find the revolutionary argument already assembled. It was assembled here. Now, we've talked about George I, and we've talked about George II, but there's another famous George that you all know, George III. And George III came to the throne in 1760 at just 22 years old. George III was the first of his line born in England, a point he made in his first address to Parliament. The Declaration of Independence indicts him personally. And the long train of charges laid against him by name and in the third person with no other defendant in view. That indictment is misleading, and understanding why is necessary to the reading of Articles 18 through Article 21 to do it correctly. George III, he did not govern as an autocrat. He could not tax, he could not maintain any army in peacetime, and he could not suspend statutes. What he did was insist on choosing ministers he trusted and on supporting them with the patronage available to him, a prerogative the Revolution settlement had left untouched. The first decade of the reign produced ministerial instability as he searched for a combination that could both command his confidence and manage the Commons. Bute, Grenville, and Rockingham, Chatham, Grafton, and from 1770, North, who lasted 12 years. The measures that provoked America were parliamentary. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, the Tea Act, and the coercive acts were statutes. When the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting authority to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That phrase is actually the constitutional dispute of the imperial crisis, and the same dispute this hour opened with. In the 1530s, Parliament had asserted that its statute could reach the church, the succession, and the property held for centuries. 236 years later, in 1776, it asserted that its statute could reach the colonies without limit. The Americans were denying against Parliament what Coke had attempted to deny against the Stuarts, that any body possesses authority bounded by nothing but its own will. This explains the shape of the Declaration. Having concluded that Parliament had no authority over them at all, the colonists could not frame their grievances against Parliament without conceding the jurisdiction they denied. Their remaining constitutional connection to Britain ran through the king, and so the indictment had to be addressed to him. The Declaration names the king because the theory of the colonists left them nowhere else to direct it. It's an interesting point of history. Now, some of the charges fit him squarely. The refusal of assent through royal instructions to governors was genuinely a prerogative act. Others attribute to George III measures adopted by Parliament. They were measures he supported, but he did not control them. Now, whether that made him a tyrant depends on the question the Declaration answers, and this hour does not. What can be said as a matter of record is that the king in Parliament Americans confronted in 1776 was a stronger institution than the personal monarchy of Charles I because it had absorbed the very constraints imposed to weaken it. A crown that could not tax alone had become a crown in Parliament that could tax without limit. That is the outcome Article 11 flags as the warning inside the triumph of 1688, and it is the condition under which the American argument had to be made. Now, Norse ministry fell in 1782 after Yorktown on the loss of common support rather than on the king's decision. And that, too, is an interesting point of history. It wasn't George III that terminated Norse ministry. It was loss of common support. This event did more to establish ministerial responsibility to Parliament than any statute of the century. George III drafted an abdication message and did not send it. The Treaty of Paris was concluded in 1783. The question the colonists had raised against unlimited parliamentary authority reappeared in Philadelphia in 1787 in a written instrument enumerating powers, and again in 1791 in amendments placing certain matters beyond legislative reach. And our concluding articles and episodes 19 through 21 will take up that attempt. Now, 4 quick disputes in this account that I do want to mention. You can skip over this section if you don't want the details where some historians disagree on the finer points, but I want to lay them out here. 1 is the case of monopolies. 2 is Godden versus Hales. 3 is the equivalent. And 4th is Cato Letters versus Locke. And so I'll start very quickly with the case of monopolies. And this is about the way that it was written after the fact by Coke. And Coke had a kind of a history of doing that, maybe adding some certain color to cases that reflected what he wanted at the moment when he wrote that. That's a claim that's often been tossed at Coke because there's not a lot of competing information against what Coke wrote. And the case of the monopolies, this was a report of his case that was published in 1615, well after the judgment. And remember, Coke argued for the patent and lost, and the case entered the constitutional memory through this report that was, again, written well after the fact. Recent scholarship holds that he shaped the paper, he shaped that report around the arguments made by the defense, thereby producing a precedent that was well suited to the prerogative battles that he would fight in the 1610s. Remember, this is before he was at odds with the monarch. He was the attorney general for the monarch, for Elizabeth. So again, these were well suited to his purposes. Now, Coke himself acknowledged that the case sat oddly in the chronology of the volume where he placed it. So the dispute is live, and we're not going to resolve that here. But I want you to have it as a cautionary tale that some of the common law tradition authority over the Stuart crown was authority that Coke wrote afterward. Okay. The second is Godden versus Hales. The court was packed, but the legal question was not frivolous. Most modern historians hold that the decision was a defensible reading of the precedents on dispensing power, even though contemporaries regarded it as plainly wrong. The historian who has surveyed the literature most closely concludes against the trend he reports, that the contemporaries had the better of it. The objection that carried in 1688 was less that James had misread the law than that the law, so read, left no statute secure. The third one, equivalent. This is the sum dispersed in Scotland around the Union of 1707. Whether it is best understood as compensation for Darien losses and arrears of public salaries or as an inducement is contested between Riley on one side and Wheatley and others on the other. Again, this episode, I'm not calling it bribery because the record is not settled on it. Yeah. And then the fourth is the weight of Cato's letters against Locke in colonial reading. On Balin's reading, colonial writers drew on Trenchard and Gordon more freely than on Locke. Later citation counts have qualified that judgment without overturning it, ranking several other authors above them among individually cited names. Balin's reading holds up best when it is narrowed to the pamphlet literature of the 1760s and 1770s. I think we can all agree that the Cato's letters and Locke were of utmost importance to our founders. And that will wrap up this companion piece. I hope that you found value in it, and you can go back to the chapter titles down below and pick and choose as you go through the rest of this series. I wanted to certainly get this out before we go through the stretch of articles and episodes 8 through 15. If you do not know the monarchical history of Britain, it is very important for you to have that understanding in the back of your head as you go through these other episodes. It will help them make a lot more sense, particularly as we listen to these arguments, as we listen to the philosophy as it evolves on its way to 1776. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been Self-Evident Companion, The Crown and the Kingdom on the Consequential Action Podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find the written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and the Empire of Liberty, all of which have roots within the information that we discussed here today. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for all video versions of our podcast episodes. Subscriptions, views, likes, comments, they really help push the algorithm to get this information out to more viewers. And of course, follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and timely announcements, commentary on current events, things that tie back to our founders and on the ideas of liberty. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.